The morning of the 1st of July, 1863, did not break with light. It broke with a suffocating, gray mist that clung to the rolling fields of Pennsylvania like a shroud. It dampened every sound, turning the distant creak of wagon wheels into a hollow, muffled thud. Nothing moved on the horizon. The air held a biting, damp chill that seeped into the ground, turning the soil into a thick, clinging sludge. General Robert E. Lee stood on the crest of a high ridge, his body a rigid silhouette against the pale sky. He held a pair of binoculars to his eyes, scanning the wall of fog that stretched across the valley. He did not blink. His posture remained locked, his breath forming small, fleeting clouds in the stagnant air. Below him, the landscape was a void of shifting white vapor, hiding the earth and the movements of thousands. He waited for the wind to tear a hole in the veil, to reveal what lay concealed in the low ground. The silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of an approaching storm that had yet to announce its arrival. He lowered the glasses, his gaze fixed on the stillness, listening for the first tremor of iron on stone. The map lay spread across a wooden crate, its edges curled by the persistent dampness. Lee traced the ink lines that snaked north, past the border, toward a goal that felt both inevitable and fragile. He had not marched this far to fight a war of attrition. He had come to force a conclusion. The plan was clear. Strike at the heart of the North, shatter the confidence of the populace, and compel a peace agreement before the resources of his own army were bled dry. Every mile they had covered in the last 2 weeks had been a gamble against time and supply. He pressed his knuckles into the paper, hard enough to leave indentations in the wood beneath. If he failed here, the war would drag on into a cycle of destruction that neither side could sustain. He looked toward the horizon, past the mist, visualizing the path to a conclusion that would justify the march. The pressure of the decision sat behind his eyes, a steady, throbbing constant. He knew the outcome of this invasion would dictate the fate of the nation. He stood straight, exhaled, and tightened his grip on the edge of the crate. The target was no longer a vague idea on a map. It was a tangible point in space, waiting for his move. The silence on the ridge did not last. A faint, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the dry earth, the sound of hooves striking hard ground. Lee turned his head slowly. The sound grew, shifting from a distant pulse into a rapid, uneven drumbeat that tore through the morning stillness. A lone figure crested the rise, the horse lathered in sweat, its sides heaving with every labored breath. The rider pulled back on the reins, the animal sliding through the loose dirt, coming to a halt just feet from where Lee stood. The scout was covered in dust, his face tight with the exhaustion of a long, frantic ride. He did not wait for an invitation. He pointed a shaking finger toward the town of Gettysburg, visible now as the morning sun began to burn through the last of the haze. The news was blunt and carried the weight of a physical blow. The Union Army of the Potomac had arrived. The words hung in the air, stripping away the time for further deliberation. The strategic landscape had fundamentally altered in a heartbeat. Lee stiffened, his eyes locking onto the direction of the town, his hand dropping to his side as the reality of the situation took hold. Lee remained motionless, the scout's report echoing in the sudden silence of the ridge. He did not ask for details. He did not ask for numbers. The presence of the enemy in Gettysburg was the only fact that mattered. He lowered his binoculars, the metal clicking softly against his palm. His gaze swept across the fields one last time, measuring the distance, the slope, and the position of the unseen threat. There would be no retreat. There would be no repositioning. The gamble he had initiated weeks ago had reached its apex. He turned to his officers, his movements precise and devoid of hesitation. He gave the order to engage. The command was sharp, carried by the wind down the slope to the waiting lines below. It was the point of no return. The stillness of the morning shattered as the infantry began to move, their boots turning the soft earth into a rhythmic, grinding sound of impending conflict. He watched as his men surged forward, a mass of motion pouring down the ridge. The decision was made. The collision was inevitable. The battle for the soil of Pennsylvania had begun, and the weight of the war now rested entirely on the steel and resolve of those marching into the haze. The first battery fired from the ridge, a sharp crack that tore through the air. Within seconds, the horizon erupted. The roar of cannons became a constant physical presence, vibrating in the chests of every man on the field. Smoke billowed upward in thick gray columns, rapidly swallowing the sunlight and turning the morning into a dim, choking haze. The air turned metallic, heavy with the stinging, acrid scent of sulfur that coated the back of the throat. Every few seconds, the ground shuddered under the impact of incoming rounds, throwing clods of dirt and splintered wood into the air. Horses neighed in terror, their voices lost beneath the relentless thundering of the guns. Men moved through the murk, their figures reduced to blurred silhouettes against the swirling gray backdrop. There was no longer any clear line of sight. The field had dissolved into a disjointed sequence of flashes and concussions. Each blast drowned out the last, creating a wall of noise so dense it felt solid. The scale of the violence defied individual control, turning the rolling landscape into a churning cauldron of fire and debris that swallowed the light and the silence alike. The focus of the struggle shifted toward the jagged silhouette of Little Round Top. Confederate infantry broke from the main formation, their pace accelerating as they moved toward the base of the steep, rocky slope. Boots struck the uneven earth, kicking up clouds of dust that mingled with the lingering smoke. They climbed, hands reaching for protruding roots and stone to pull their weight upward against the incline. Halfway up the rise, the rhythm of their ascent broke. A volley of musketry erupted from the crest, the sound distinct and sharp against the backdrop of distant cannon fire. The advancing lines faltered, then pushed harder, trying to close the gap. They hammered against the rising ground, but the line above did not yield. Every attempt to crest the ridge met a wall of sustained fire that forced the men back into the cover of boulders and depressions. The infantry regrouped, bayonets fixed, and lunged again, but the ground remained locked. The slope became a bottleneck, a place where the momentum of the advance died against the immovable barrier of the defenders. They pressed their bodies into the dirt, listening to the whistle of lead overhead, unable to move forward, yet refusing to retreat. The fight narrowed to the jagged lines of the stone walls. Men lunged forward, their fingers clawing at the rough, heat-baked granite to gain a foothold. Every inch of ground was contested. A soldier jammed his shoulder against the base of the wall, bracing his weight to prevent being pushed back down the slope. Above him, the defenders leaned over the top, their movements mechanical and repetitive as they reloaded and fired. The sound of lead striking stone sent chips of rock flying into faces, drawing blood. There was no room for formation. The battle devolved into a series of isolated, desperate scuffles. A man scrambled over a pile of loose boulders, only to be shoved back by a rifle butt. He landed hard in the dirt, gasping for air, and immediately crawled back toward the wall. The rocks were slick with sweat and grime. Each side pushed against the other with a primal, rhythmic violence, limbs entangled and breath coming in ragged, shallow heaves. The wall became the only reality in the world. Neither side possessed the strength to advance, yet neither side possessed the will to withdraw. They remained locked in that narrow, bloodied gap, straining against the immovable weight of their counterparts until movement itself became an impossible luxury. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the churned earth. The roar of the day died down, replaced by a low, dissonant chorus of groans and the distant, rhythmic clatter of wagon wheels. Men dropped their weapons into the dirt, their hands trembling too violently to grip wood or iron. They sat slumped against the very walls they had struggled to conquer, chests heaving in the cooling evening air. The sulphurous haze thickened, clinging to the grass and staining the faces of the living. Everywhere, the ground was mapped by the fallen, creating a stillness that felt heavier than the battle itself. Commanders walked the lines, stepping over debris and equipment, their boots heavy with mud and blood. No one spoke. The exhaustion was absolute, a physical weight that pinned every man to the earth. Across the fields, the opposing camps mirrored this silence. The lines were held, but the cost was etched into the stillness of the landscape. 2 days of unrelenting movement had culminated in this absolute deadlock. The armies occupied separate ridges, eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes of their counterparts, waiting for a shift that did not come. The night air grew cold, yet the men remained where they had fallen, too depleted to seek shelter, bound by the invisible tension of a war that had ground to a halt. The morning mist clung to the ground, silver and unmoving. Robert E. Lee stood on the crest of the ridge, his feet planted wide to steady himself against the slope. He lifted his binoculars, the metal cold against his brow. He did not sweep the horizon. He focused on the specific, jagged gaps in his own lines. Regiments that had been full strength 2 days prior now stood as clusters of ragged men, their formation broken by the attrition of the previous night. He lowered the glass, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. He looked toward the Union positions, tracing the distance across the open fields with a slow, deliberate movement of his head. The space between them was empty. Save for the debris of the battle, Lee shifted his weight, his boots grinding into the loose shale. He checked his watch, then turned his gaze back to his subordinate commanders. They waited in silence, their faces marked by the same layer of grime and fatigue as the men below. Lee took a deep breath, the air tasting of damp earth and smoke. He did not speak. He simply stared across the expanse, his jaw tight, weighing the remaining strength of his army against the impossible reach of his objective. The silence was absolute, a suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the very motion from the air. He turned his horse, and the decision began to take shape in his eyes. Lee motioned for his officers to gather. They moved closer, boots crunching on the dry grass, the only sound in the sudden quiet of the morning. He did not point to the hills or the flanks. He leveled a finger at the center, a flat stretch of land that lay entirely exposed to the enemy ridge. He traced a line through the dirt with his riding crop, marking a path that cut through the heart of the field. His officers looked at the map, then at the distance, then back at him. Nobody offered a suggestion. The logic of the maneuver was clear. It was a direct, headlong collision. Lee straightened his spine, his movements precise and deliberate. He signaled for General Pickett. When the subordinate arrived, Lee spoke in a low, steady tone, detailing the formation and the trajectory. He did not look for agreement. He laid out the requirements for the assault as if they were simple logistics. Pickett listened, his eyes fixed on the distant Union line, his jaw set. The gravity of the command hung in the space between them, a tangible weight that silenced the nearby scouts. Lee gave one final nod, turning his horse away from the ridge. The gamble was set. The order moved down the chain, pulling men from their rest and forcing them into the final, fatal formation. The order rippled through the woods. Men rose from the dirt, shifting their weight and checking their gear with practiced, mechanical movements. A single command echoed, and the first ranks began to move. They stepped forward, passing the edge of the tree line where the shade ended and the open field began. The sun hit them with immediate, searing intensity. Thousands emerged from the woods in a steady, unbroken flow. They did not run. They walked, their pace rhythmic and deliberate, forming a long, rigid line that stretched across the landscape. The crunch of thousands of boots on dry grass created a low, constant vibration that seemed to pulse through the ground. The field ahead opened up, a vast expanse of green and brown that offered no cover. Every man kept his eyes locked forward, staring at the distant, shimmering crest of the enemy ridge. The heat rose in waves from the earth, distorting the horizon. They moved as a single, living entity, their formation tight and unwavering. In the center of the clearing, the line solidified, a wall of men advancing into the glare. The edge of the woods fell behind them, and the distance to the enemy line suddenly felt like an impossible, yawning chasm. The mile ahead was a gauntlet of open wheat and broken fence lines. There was no shadow, no fold in the earth to hide behind. The men marched, their boots kicking up fine clouds of dust that hung in the stagnant air. Each step forward took them further from the safety of the woods and deeper into the absolute stillness of the valley. From the far ridge, the Union line remained perfectly quiet. They watched. The silence was heavier than any roar of cannon fire. It was a calculated, patient wait. The Confederate ranks maintained their alignment, a perfect, slow-moving wave crossing the farmland. A soldier tripped on a hidden stone, stumbled, and was immediately pulled back into line by the men on either side without a word spoken. They kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the blue-coated soldiers stood behind their stone walls. The distance seemed to stretch, the crest of the ridge refusing to grow closer despite the steady pace. Every minute felt like an hour. The sun beat down, turning the effort of walking into a grueling, rhythmic test of endurance. They were exposed, vulnerable, and moving toward a wall that watched them with cold, silent intent. The tension tightened like a wire pulled to its breaking point. The stillness snapped. It did not break. It shattered. On the crest of Cemetery Ridge, a singular, sharp signal cut through the valley. A heartbeat later, the entire horizon vanished behind a wall of white smoke. The Union cannons erupted in a synchronized, thunderous roar that slammed into the chest of every man on the field. The ground beneath the advancing ranks bucked. Dirt, stone, and iron fragments geysered into the air, creating a chaotic curtain of debris. The sound was no longer noise, it was a physical weight, a continuous, grinding blast that erased all other thought. High above, the air whistled with the passage of hundreds of shells, a high-pitched, tearing shriek that culminated in blinding flashes of fire across the center of the Confederate formation. The orderly, rhythmic march dissolved. Men were thrown off their feet by the sheer concussion of the air. Others turned their heads to the sky as the world turned to flame. The silence that had held the valley in its grip for the last half-mile was replaced by a screaming, industrial hell. The advance had met the wall of fire, and in an instant, the open field transformed into a violent, churning graveyard of smoke and iron. Iron shells plowed into the earth, throwing up geysers of soil and red clay that rained down on the advancing columns. Where a man had walked a second before, it was now only a crater and a smear of red. The ranks were shredded, yet the momentum did not stop. A soldier to the left of the center line crumpled, his rifle skittering away into the wheat. The man behind him did not break stride. He stepped over the body, eyes fixed forward, his boots catching on the uneven, churned-up ground. Another shell struck, tearing a gap in the front rank. The remaining men shifted laterally, closing the hole with mechanical precision. They walked through a storm of shrapnel that hissed through the air like angry hornets. Every few yards, a man went down, clutching at limbs or simply collapsing as the shock waves rattled their bones. There was no room to scream. The survivors kept their heads low, shoulders squared against the wind of the explosions, moving forward through the thickening haze of sulfur and dust. They were a singular, battered entity, stepping over their own fallen, grinding their way toward the stone wall through a landscape that had become a slaughterhouse. The final 50 yards were a run through a furnace. The survivors hit the stone wall not as a formation, but as a desperate, jagged wave of humanity. They slammed into the barrier, hands clawing at the rough granite, boots slipping on the blood-slicked turf. On the other side, the Union line stood firm, rifles leveled, point blank. The sound of gunfire changed instantly from a distant roar to a sharp, deafening crackle of muskets fired into chests. There was no reloading. The air became a tangle of iron barrels and swinging rifle butts. Men vaulted the wall, only to be met by bayonets. A soldier swung his weapon like a club, the stock splintering against a stone post. Another grabbed a fence rail, using it to push back the encroaching mass. The stone wall became the fulcrum of the entire conflict. Bodies piled up against the granite, creating a grisly ramp for those who followed behind. This was the high water mark. For a few frantic, bloody minutes, the struggle was entirely hand-to-hand, a chaotic knot of locked limbs and desperate grunts. No one fired. No one shouted orders. It was a primal, grinding stalemate where every inch of ground was bought with a life, and the momentum of the entire war stalled against the unyielding edge of the wall. The balance tipped. A fresh line of Union troops rose from the smoke, their bayonets catching the afternoon light. They surged forward, not with a shout, but with a steady, crushing weight that hammered into the exhausted Confederate ranks. The men at the wall staggered back. The makeshift line, held together by sheer desperation, disintegrated. A soldier lost his footing, sliding down the embankment, and was instantly trampled by those fleeing behind him. The retreat began not as a planned maneuver, but as a blind, frantic scramble toward the tree line. Rifles were dropped in the grass. Men turned and ran, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, abandoning the ground they had died to reach. The Union fire intensified, raking the open field with a relentless, rhythmic thud. Each impact sent another man sprawling into the dirt. Those who remained upright didn't look back. They sprinted, lungs burning, tripping over the remnants of their own advance. The wave of soldiers that had marched across the field with such terrible purpose was now a shattered, retreating mass. The momentum had not just stalled, it had reversed, leaving only a trail of discarded gear and broken bodies strewn across the open, exposed farmland. The roar of cannons died out, replaced by a low, hollow ringing in the ears. Then, the silence arrived. It was heavy, settling over the rolling fields like a shroud as the sun dipped below the horizon. The smoke began to thin, revealing the true cost of the 3-day struggle. The fields were no longer a scene of movement, but a vast, frozen tableau. Bodies lay in rows, some near the stone wall, others scattered deep into the open grass. There were no more shouts, no more bugle calls, only the sound of the wind moving through the tall stalks. 50,000 men remained on the ground, their forms darkening as the shadows lengthened across the earth. The sky turned a bruised purple, casting a cold light over the wreckage of gear and broken equipment. Every ridge, every fence line, and every patch of dirt held the evidence of the collision. The intensity of the last 72 hours had vanished, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt like a physical weight. Nothing moved, nothing breathed in the tall grass. The landscape had been transformed into a silent, sprawling graveyard, marking the end of the assault and the irreversible toll of the conflict. General Robert E. Lee stood on the ridge, his gaze fixed on the broken lines of his retreating army. He watched the remnants of his divisions limp back toward the tree line, their formations dissolved into small, exhausted groups. The ambition that had driven his march across the border hung in the stagnant, smoke-filled air, now reduced to a hollow, unreachable goal. He pulled the reins of his horse, the animal shifting its weight on the uneven ground. His hands were steady, but his movements were slow. Weighted by the sheer magnitude of the loss, he turned the horse away from the field, toward the south. There was no order to be shouted, no maneuver left to execute. His offensive capability had been shattered on the slopes of the ridge. As the horse began its steady walk, he did not look back at the fields or the thousands of men who would not be returning. The direction of the war had shifted in these 3 days, and the retreat was the final confirmation of that change. He moved down the slope, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving the northern soil behind forever. The army followed in a long, silent column, leaving the broken landscape to the silence of the night. Months passed. The summer heat faded, replaced by the crisp, biting wind of November. The fields were no longer littered with the wreckage of combat. Instead, they were organized into rows of white markers that stretched toward the horizon, crossing the ridges where the fighting had been most fierce. The ground had been cleared, leveled, and prepared for the final resting places of those who had fallen. A small crowd stood in the distance, their heads bowed against the chill. A carriage pulled to a halt on the edge of the field. A tall, gaunt man stepped down onto the grass. He moved slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. He looked out over the expanse of fresh graves, his eyes scanning the lines that marked the true cost of the conflict. He did not speak. He walked past the rows, his movements measured and deliberate. The air was still, lacking the sulphurous haze of the battle. He stopped near the center of the field and stood for a long moment, the silence of the cemetery framing his presence. The violence of July had been replaced by a heavy, profound solemnity. He adjusted his stance, looked at the horizon, and prepared to address the silence. Lincoln reached into his coat and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. His fingers brushed the rough texture of the page. A sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, tugging at the paper, forcing him to grip it firmly with both hands. He smoothed the creases, his knuckles pale against the darkening sky. He looked up, scanning the faces of the families and soldiers gathered before him. They stood motionless, waiting. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and clear in the stillness of the cemetery. He began to speak. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying across the rows of white markers. He spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to a singular binding principle. Every word hit the air with the weight of the men buried beneath his feet. He did not look at the paper as he reached the final lines. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, toward the future. He defined the unfinished work that remained for those still living. The struggle had not ended with the cannon fire. It was being forged anew in his words. As he finished, the wind died down. The weight of the sacrifice was no longer just a tally of the dead, but a foundation for the nation that would endure.